Well, good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. And I'm delighted, Helena. Thank you so much for joining this evening. I've been very excited about this evening, I can tell you. So I know Helena Kennedy needs no introduction, but I am going to have to give you just a little abridged version.
No, there might be loads of people out there who don't know who the devil I am.
Who you are, but they just turned up anyway. But I am going to give a short introduction to Helena's incredible career. And as I say, this is very much an abridged version because I think we would probably be here for most of the evening, Helena, if I went through everything, but we can explore many different avenues. So for me, quite simply, Baroness Kennedy is a towering figure in human rights law in the UK and internationally. And also for me, she just is the most incredible role model. I think a true exemplar of the best of what a lawyer can and should be. Values-driven, committed, articulate, passionate in championing those who have the least power within societies, and above all, incredibly effective. She's an absolutely pioneering human rights lawyer. She's argued and argues incessantly and effectively for social justice through law. And her talent, drive, and commitment are absolutely formidable. She founded Doughty Street Chambers, which is a leading human rights group of barristers, when she was almost fresh out of law school, it seems. Pretty much fresh out of law school, I think. And has acted in numerous high-profile human rights cases in England and Wales over several decades. And these are the really crunchy cases, so several terrorism-related cases, including, for example, the Brighton bombing at the Tory party conference during Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister, the Guildford 4 case related to IRA, the troubles in Northern Ireland, the jihadist fertiliser bomb plot, and the transatlantic bomb plot most recently. But she's also been a passionate advocate of women's rights and has argued for decades through her practice and her writing that law and the legal system ignore, underrate, and discriminate against women, often in the name of equality. And she's been a powerful force in reforming both law and the legal profession's attitude to gender equality and minority access, and has chaired many public inquiries, including the inquiry into sudden infant death syndrome in 2004, and the European Commission on Human Rights inquiry in Scotland in 2012, leading to a Scottish parliamentary inquiry on misogyny. But her work is also international, and she's internationally recognised as an authority on violence against women and children, and she's worked on sexual violence as a weapon of war, and in 2023 led an inquiry into gender apartheid. And her international work has included cases on extradition, the removal of citizenship, statelessness, deportation, trafficking, and torture. As I say, these are the hard edges of criminal law. She doesn't shy away from anything. She was part of an expert team advising the UN rapporteur on the extrajudicial killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and is one of the few people to have been permitted to hear the high security tapes of that killing. But I mentioned before that Helena is incredibly effective, and she's also very practical. And the most remarkable achievement of all your achievements, I think, Helena, but we can dispute which is the most amazing, which was in 2021 when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. She evacuated 102 women judges and prosecutors who were on death lists, raising funds, securing safe houses, chartering planes, resettling women around the world. And with their husbands and children, over 500 people were brought to safety. And she's currently working with the President of Ukraine on war crimes and the recovery of thousands of the children who've been abducted from Ukraine by Russian forces. And all of these we can explore this evening. But Helena is also firmly committed to education and to the opportunities educational and vocational training provides, particularly to those who are socially and economically disadvantaged. She has over 40 honorary doctorates, I think. Has been Chancellor of 2 universities and head of Knoxville College. Yeah. But also founded and is head of the Helena Kennedy Foundation, which gives bursaries to disadvantaged students. So the list of her activities and achievements goes on, but she doesn't rest. So she's currently President of Justice, the Law Reform think tank, the Director of the International Bars Association Human Rights Institute. For over 25 years has been a member of the House of Lords, where she's a member of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. She's a broadcaster, passionate supporter of the arts, supporting, amongst other things, she's been on the board of the British Museum, the London Festival of Theatre, is chair of the Creative Industry Standards Authority. She was Her list of public service goes on. She was chair of the Human Genetics Commission and of the British Council. She was also most recently awarded the honour of the Lady of the Thistle.
Lady of the Thistle. It sounds so nice.
I know, it sounds so nice, which is
prickly,
amazing, and a rather splendid costume.
Fabulous costume with an ostrich feather in the hat.
Nothing understated. But it's also an honour which is awarded directly by the monarch, by the king, for her contribution to human rights and justice. So as you can see, Helena, you have prodigious energy, and to be honest, you do so much. I'm convinced there must be at least 3 or 4 of you. I think it's just a sham that there's only one of you. I'm sure you've got duplicates and doppelgangers around. And as I say, I have barely scratched the surface on everything that you've done and the impact that you've had across so many areas of law and policy. And yet, amongst all of those activities, she remains, as an honorary fellow of the British Academy, a staunch supporter of the Academy, a fantastic member of our development board, and we can always rely on you, Helena. It's incredible. I don't know how you fit us in, but we're very glad you do.
Everybody saw the stuff that goes on, and I am an autodidact. I like learning new stuff, and I come here and I learn new stuff.
And you learn new stuff. Excellent, excellent. But I want to almost take you back to the beginning. I mean, you've done many things other than law, but law has been central in your life.
Oh, yeah.
So what was it that drove you to law? What was your initial drive and passion and motivation?
I mean, it's only by looking back that you can see the threads that somehow weave into decisions that you make. But I was the first in my family to go on to higher education. My parents left school at 14 and were working class people, but wanted education for their children. But my 2 older sisters, who were 9 and 10 years older than me because they were born before the Second World War, or just as it was starting, and then my father went off into the forces, as so many men of that generation did. And he was away because he didn't come back immediately as the war ended, because he was, by that time, although a working class man, he was in the intelligence corps, and they were then in France, and they were rounding up collaborators and people. And so his thing went on a bit longer than 45. He didn't come back until 46. And so my sister, myself, and a boy who died were all born after the Second World War, and so there's a big gap. But my parents were really good people, and were themselves very, I think, very committed to social justice. And so I think that we got it on it was there at the dinner table. It was there in our responsibility to other people. So I wanted to do law, really, because I thought that it was an instrument of change. I really didn't imagine that I would end up being, a bencher of Gray's Inn and a King's Counsel and all that. I started because I thought I might be a trade union lawyer. My father was a trade unionist. My mother wanted me to be a teacher, and I applied originally to Glasgow University to do English because I loved reading in books. And then I came down and got a summer job, and that changed everything. I sort of decided that I wanted to flee the coup, and I came down and I ended up doing law because I got interested through a number of other students that I met, and I decided to do that. But people then, it's funny, teachers said afterwards that I had talked about doing law. I don't have any recollection of that, although I was a great debater. Our school used to debate, although it was a big working class school. Debating in Scotland was part and parcel of the education system. And I mean, we all learned to debate and to ask the difficult questions and so on. And I remember when I was about 12, Mr. Lavelle, who was the Latin teacher, and I did Latin, and he got me to do Greek as well. He said to me, "You should be learning to debate." And we had a debate on the death penalty, and he said, "You'll be on the side of you're in favour of the death penalty, you're against it." And I went, "Oh, I'm not in favour of the death penalty." And he said, "That's the whole point." And of course, in a way, there is a preparing you for law, which is to think of what the other side's argument will be, how is this going to be argued, and sometimes having to think of an argument in cases where you weren't necessarily particularly sympathetic yourself. I mean, that's the nature of law, is that you're doing it because you believe that a system that provides due process to examine issues is so vitally important. And I firmly believe it passionately that in the importance of people's right to be heard and the fairness of trial process, whoever that person may be. And so I'm a believer in the Erskine principle, the cab rank rule, that you represent people even if you're sort of not wholly in sympathy with their views of the world.
Yeah. But I mean, just thinking about coming down to London in the 70s and the way that the law profession was set up, the legal system was set up. I mean, it wasn't a particularly opening its arms to women coming into the law at that time.
Well, I'm much older than you are, Julia, and I started the business of going into the law in the 70s. It was about, I mean, I thought it was 5%, but somebody who qualified the same year as me, Hilary Heilbronn, whose mother was Rose Heilbronn, the first woman sort of High Court judge, and she was from a very law family, and I was from the tenements of Glasgow. But she's always said that there were only 4% of the bar were women. So it was you were a rare thing, and I qualified before the Sex Discrimination Act, and so you'd apply to sets of chambers for pupillage, and they'd say to you, "We don't take women. We don't take women in this set of chambers," and and you would sort of, oh, and you'd yeah, and that was it. Or when the Sex Discrimination Act came in, they'd say, "Women, we've got one." And that was it. They'd passed the test. They had one, and so it was hard to get into sets of chambers. And so you're asking about setting up sets of chambers. There were a little group of us, and it's interesting because most of us were from pretty ordinary backgrounds, and it was hard to get into sets of chambers, and particularly if you're a woman. And 6 of us got together, 3 men and 3 women. And one of the women was an out gay woman at a time when that was really, people were not easily and readily coming out as being gay. And Marguerite did at the bar and was proud and out. And it was the beginning, of course, of the women's movement. It was the 70s. And so we decided we had a little meeting, and we said we'd set up our own set of chambers. Nobody's heard of doing such a thing at the time. And we set up, it started off, I'm going to confess to a crime in that there used to be a notice board on Middle Temple Lane, and it had glass that moved across like that, and they used to have adverts of choral concerts in places or some event in an Inn of Court. And I saw in it a little card that said 2 rooms to rent, possibly an annex to a set of chambers. And so I looked to see if anybody was coming, and I moved the glass along. I stole it off the notice board, and so we applied for it, and we got it because nobody else applied. and so that was how we set up a set of chambers. And so I was actually involved. I've always liked being involved in new projects. And so I was in that set of chambers for 10 years. And then Michael Mansfield, who was a very successful barrister who was older than me, and I used to do lots of cases with him at that time, civil liberties cases, and then it became terrorist cases. The Irish Troubles presented lots of issues. And he was wanting to set up a new set of chambers, and I went with him to kind of make sure that he did. And so we set up Tooks Court. And then about 5 years later, I was wanting to do more international work, and that was when Doughty Street was created. So I went with Jeff Robertson and Ed Fitzgerald and a group of people. And now, of course, Keir Starmer was in there, Amal Clooney's in there. It became this sort of very kind of glamorous human rights place.
No, absolutely. Fantastic pedigree. But, I mean, through that, you talked about the cab rank rule and taking on cases, as you say, that you don't...
Difficult cases.
Difficult cases.
But I only mention the business about who you represent. My mother used to say, why can't you get any nice clients? But all I can say, because I did things, regular, ordinary crime. I acted for Myra Hindley, not when she committed, when she was convicted of the terrible thing with Ian Brady, the child murders. But she tried to escape from prison, and at one point, and so I was the junior counsel in that. And so I did regular crime. And you don't, pick and choose what you do because you believe that people should be well represented, whatever. But it's as if the tabloid press don't believe that or know that. And so they automatically, you hear, Keir Starmer being vilified because he represented, this person and that person, and as though, like in American movies, you pick and choose who you represent. It's not like that at the bar here. Yeah. And so if you were holding yourself out as being a serious criminal lawyer, you represent and your clerks would secure cases and so on. And of course, you wanted challenging, difficult cases because sometimes you were having to rise above public prejudice. And often, especially when it was terrorism, people got rolled into those cases. I mean, I did the Guildford 4 appeal, and those men were framed. They really were framed for things that they hadn't committed and spent 17 years in jail. And it all came out in the wash. But I mean, after an awful lot of terrible damage had been done, but the Irish community came under incredible scrutiny, and the assumption was that if somebody was a Republican, that was they were in favour of a united Ireland, that they were a bad hat, and so people were really vulnerable to that sort of determination. The public won't, arrests for terrible bombings that took place, but that gave a kind of permission to cut corners and to lead to wrongful convictions. And so it was a very hard time. But people and people say to me now, I just recently did a thing around the issue of the Middle East and Gaza. I did a thing for the International Criminal Court, and let me tell you, nowadays, of course, you're trolled. You're sent thousands of emails telling you what a terrible woman you are, and that you must be an anti-Semite, even when you're just measuring and seeing whether thresholds of international law are being passed. And that didn't happen, of course, back in the day when there was no social media. But we did get a lot of other stuff. We did get threatening letters. I had to go ex-directory when I was doing those cases. And there was an assumption that somehow, you were pro-terrorism, which was mad. I mean, but the media, lends itself to that, and people often don't understand that the reason that we look after anybody's case, the Erskine principle, which is that you defend whoever, when you're asked to defend somebody, and the reason we do that is to protect the system, to make sure that people are represented and well represented. But you often don't get that, and it's like the business of after the Brexit thing. Of the tabloids, you'll remember the Daily Mail headline of calling the judges enemies of the people. I mean, it's that idea that, somehow that people must be biased rather when in fact you're trained to bring us an independent, set of judgments to bear as a judge at that level.
Absolutely. But I think that's just one of the interesting things that you've also brought out in your work is so I completely, and I think you passionately articulated the values of the fair trial in upholding the rule of law and being absolutely central to our democratic system, and the openness in which we have to have trials in order to see that justice is being done in that very open way. But I think one of the really interesting things I found about your work was when you were thinking about how women are perceived by the law but also treated by the legal system, where your argument is that actually that sort of sense of objectivity or independence and equality in a formal sense has actually been severely disadvantaging women in a substantive sense. And I think that's a really interesting element of your work that you pulled out for many years.
But that really came, Julia, because when I started practicing, I mean, I came from a background where I was, socially idealistic, and I wanted to represent ordinary people in the court system. I became very involved in community law centres and the National Council of Civil Liberties, which is Liberty, and different organisations that were trying to use the law to better ends or to represent those who suffered the consequences of law. So in the 70s, there were issues like racism, very raw racism. There was the whole persecution of people. It was mainly men, but men who were gay, and it was really awful. That people would. There were very few, but there were gay pubs in London, and young men coming out of them would be followed by the vice squad, and they would often be sort of set up on charges, and they would be too frightened to fight them because they would go with a lawyer, and if there wasn't a journalist in the court, they would put their hands up to things that they hadn't actually done and plead guilty because they didn't want their parents and their families to know or their employers to know, all that kind of stuff. And it became very clear to me that justice, you have to contextualize it and understand the lives and the social context of how things are. And for women, most of the women that I was acting for in courts, and of course they make a small proportion of the work you do, but for most of them, they themselves were the victims of the most awful stuff. Lots of domestic violence, which was very poorly dealt with by the courts. If there was sexual violence, they were always accused of being liars and having made it up, and so they didn't feel believed. They didn't feel answered. There was no answer to the wrongs they experienced. So I started sort of noticing, the ways in which that worked, and then I started sort of doing my research on it, and it was very clear. I mean, it's pretty obvious to us all now, but the ways in which law were made did not include women. So it wasn't the least bit surprising that law wasn't going to deliver for those who are excluded from laws making. And that was either, as judges, because our system of the common law is very much about creating precedent, which is then passed down to lower courts. And there was hardly a woman in sight in the higher courts where that was made, as you know, and Parliament was pretty thin on the ground when it came to women, and certainly not in big major roles that affected the creation of law. So it wasn't surprising that law was therefore very male-centric, and it was made to deal with male-accused people and for the ways in which men were perceived to be, and it didn't work for women. I mean, that work that I did around provocation was very important because once I was getting more senior, I saw it all at a low level, that, the prisons were full of women, who'd done nothing, who shoplifted and so forth. And then the heartbreaking stuff that, their kids would then, as a result, be taken into care because their husband had pissed off. And their kids would be taken away from them. They would lose their council house, all that sort of stuff. And the consequence of it was crazy, and the cost, social cost, instead of helping people sort out the problems in life. But often they were in that situation because they themselves, as children, had been abused, or either violently or sexually. And so there was so much of that stuff in the background. And I started sort of researching it and then writing about it. And that I really started concentrating my mind on the ways. And once I was doing more serious cases, I ended up representing women who had been subjected to terrible violence, and then who themselves might kill their partner or whatever. And I ended up doing homicides affecting women. And women couldn't call in pray in aid the defences that had been created for murder because they were so ill-suited to women, because women were so rarely in that position. Yeah. I was on the tube the other day, and a woman was looking at me, and she said to me, "Are you who I think you are?" And I said, "Well, if you're thinking of killing your husband, I could be your woman." Everybody in the compartment was kind of a bit interested. I should have had cards to give out. Anyway, but it made me start looking at law's failure around defences that there were for things, and how they didn't work for women, because it was the idea was that you were in a moment of passion provoked by finding your wife with a lover, that you would run them both through with a knife, and that idea of no longer being master of your mind didn't often fit for the ways that women ended up killing their partner, because often it would be looked like as if it was premeditated, that he was drunk, but she knew that he was going to waken up and possibly kill her. And so she would hit him on the head with a hammer or something.
Absolutely, this long, continual
Yeah, I always used to say it was like knicker elastic that eventually gives out. You know, they would eventually give up the ghost, and I mean, it's comparatively rare, but you know, I did a whole range of those cases, and then wrote about it, and it was, I waited, I was writing occasional columns and appearing on Women's Hour and broadcasting quite a bit, and then I did a whole set of programs called Hypotheticals, for the BBC. And so I started doing a certain amount of broadcasting, which gave me a voice around using ordinary language to talk about law, which is you know, can be mystified with, you know, the language of law. And I think I was quite good at making, you know, kind of demystifying law and showing where it's failed and why it failed. And I enjoyed doing that. And I actually, at one stage in the late 80s, worked with a wonderful playwright called Peter Flannery, and we wrote a television series based a lot on cases that I had done, called Blind Justice. And so I was exploring all those different things, and I always loved theatre and knew people who were in the theatre world, and so it kind of stimulated the idea of doing that. But sometimes it can be through doing television things that you can actually tell stories and sort of, if you like, display the problems more effectively than just talking about them.
I mean, Alan Bates in the post office. That Alan Bates in the post office, you know, that long-running saga, been going on for years and years and years. And then assisted by British Academy funding, actually, in some cases, on that script, but bringing that to life in a very, very real way.
The post office scandal, I mean, when you think of the numbers of people who were involved in and the horror of that, but I did quite a lot of miscarriages of justice cases, you know, fighting them in the Court of Appeal. Cases, I did a number of the Irish cases where there were serious miscarriages of justice. And I did others. You know, I mean, I always remember I had a woman, Mary Druin, and she spent 11 years in prison on a murder that she hadn't committed. And she was basically an alcoholic whose husband had died and she fell apart. Anyway, I mean, the long and the short of it was that there was a fire somewhere, and it was assumed that she had done it because she'd sort of been in a pub and said, you know, I'll kill the whole lot of you or something. And people say those things, and then the idea that you could take it as. But she spent a long time in prison, and I remember when I first went to see her, she'd been infantilized by the prison process. She was like a little girl, and she stood up waiting to be told she could sit down like she was at school. You know, those things, you know, help you to really. I mean, that's what makes you believe that human rights matters, and that's where you learn as a lawyer, as long as you make yourself open to learning about what the human cost.
Absolutely, you have a wonderful phrase. So, your first book, Eve Was Framed, which is a fantastic title, by the way.
I know. It was through being at a table with a crowd of women, and at one stage sort of saying, you know, that of course, in many ways, the whole business of the ills of the world are in that story of Adam and Eve, and of course that Eve was the person who tempted him to take the apple, and all of that, and somebody at the table did say, bloody Eve was framed, never mind the IRA. And so it gave me the title to the book.
I don't know where that came from. Yeah, on the basis of the evidence of one uncorroborated evidence of one man. That was fantastic.
Absolutely.
But you've also got a fantastic...
And the childbirth apparently was visited on us, the pain of childbirth for being such a wicked person as Eve was.
But you have a wonderful phrase in that book, which is that justice should not be blind. So, but should be all-seeing, should really see.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, how much do you think has changed? I mean, we still hear of, for example, domestic abuse cases being reported as common assaults, so you still don't necessarily get the full picture. I mean, you've obviously been incredibly effective, you and others, in changing key elements. I mean, you just talked, for example, there about the defence of provocation and many other aspects. But to what extent do you think law really now still doesn't see women in the way that it should?
Well, I mean, one of the things that was, I mean, the more recent book that I wrote, it's called, the paperback's called Misjustice, is really came about after Harvey Weinstein, that whole scandal of Me Too. and it wasn't that women hadn't been complaining. Women had gone to authorities, had gone to the BBC to complain about Jimmy Savile and stuff, but and just weren't listened to. And that was the thing that, I mean, women felt that their voices didn't count. Yeah. And so I mean, I think there are problems, and then you somehow think you're getting somewhere, and then some horror, like that terrible business of a young woman being picked up by the police officer and then murdered. I mean, so it somehow doesn't seem to go away.
Yeah.
I mean, at the moment, it is very high on the agenda, and government is saying that they're doing stuff about all of that. But it does mean unearthing very embedded feelings that exist within our social constructs. Feelings of misogyny. I mean, misogyny isn't. I always make a point of saying, but misogyny is not about hating women. Yeah. It's about a sense in which there is a sort of strata in society. I mean, they're saying just now that this is what so many young men in America voted for Trump about. But it was that men had a sense of, if you like, entitlement about their status in society. There's a feeling that with women's demands for equality, that many of those jobs that men had expectations were going to be theirs have to be shared much more widely, and the competition is a much wider one. And so they feel these bloody women are coming in. And men, there's this whole sort of way in which that's being challenged by young women. And I think creating new ways of negotiating new relationships is hard. Yeah. And so, I mean, I do think that you can't do justice without understanding what's going on in the wider society. And that's, I think you have a duty as a lawyer to know and understand, expose yourself to the stuff that brings you close to that. And I always say that, misogyny is not, men don't hate women, but they often feel that women, that they should retain the primary role. Yeah. And that there exist that sort of sense of entitlement to certain things, and there is something painful in the process of actually having to cede power, people, and so it's I think that I always say that misogyny is not about men hating women. It's about not liking certain kinds of women, and that sometimes are women who are very assertive or. I mean, the whole business of them hating Hillary Clinton was partly like that. So it's not about hatred in the ordinary way. Yeah. It's about power and status in society.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely about power, but. And there's in Scotland there's an independent commission being set up in Parliament at the moment, looking at the creation of an offence of misogyny. I mean, do you think criminalisation is the way to go? Is this the way to use law to address this issue?
I think that I chaired an inquiry in Scotland on these issues. There was a great tumult over the business of, you'll remember, just a few years ago, in relation to the business of trans women and the women's parts of the women's movement being very angry over that. And it was really the issue of sex and gender, that debate of, if a woman, isn't a woman determined by her sex? And there's no doubt that over the generations, and I always try and make the point of this, is that over time, that some of the greatest suffering that women have experienced has been because of their sex, not because of their gender, but because of their sex, because female genital mutilation and those things that have been done to women, interfering with their productivity, was to make sure that nobody else is going to have you. We want to know where our babies are coming from, and therefore you have to remain a virgin until you marry, and so forth. All those sort of rules and that stuff, which led to great punishments of women, that women, and it still happens, honour killing because you've dishonoured the family, because you've, or the business as a film that's on just now, was made from a wonderful book about the Madeleine Laundry, stories about women. It was such a source of shame for a woman to become pregnant outside of marriage that they ended up paying the most terrible price. So those punishments that women had were about women's sex and about their birth-giving properties, the fact that they did have ovaries and so on. And so we can't pretend that an awful lot of women's suffering in society hasn't come from their sex, and a lot of discrimination has come from that. But of course, there is terrible discrimination against trans people, and the suffering of trans people is terrible. I did the first trans case in an international court, in the European Court of Justice in '95. And so I've been involved in those issues, and the persecution of trans people is terrible. And so, I mean, it's about somehow, in a society which you want to be just, is to find ways of treating each other decently, and and not getting bogged down in, I think, definitions. But the fact that women's persecution as relied on our sex shouldn't mean that we can't allow. I don't mind trans women calling themselves women and being treated as women, and I think that you evaluate risk when it comes to prisons. You do all those things about shared spaces and so on. You have to protect women who have experienced terrible domestic violence, and the stress and anxiety that's placed on them if they were to be made to share very private spaces with people that they might be afraid of, even if it was they needn't. So I mean, those things, as a human society, we can find ways of resolving them, in my mind. But I don't think that we can pretend that sex doesn't matter.
Yeah. And you've taken that at the international level as well, thinking about sexual crimes in this context of conflict.
I was drawn into the whole business of what happened in the Congo. It's now over 20 years ago, that civil war. I mean, what happened to the women, oh my God, it was so terrible. And I did go out, and I know that some of the organisers, and I know Dennis McGuegy, who's the obstetrician gynecologist, who really tried to mend the bodies of those women, because we're not. I mean, this was not a simple occasional penetration. This was rape and rape and rape again, and also slitting people open with machetes. This was shooting women in the vagina. This was the destruction was so terrible to the bodies of women. And the terrible thing is it's still going on, because the Congo has rare earth minerals, and the mines are put down in order to get this thing so that we can have our mobile phones and our computers and so on, and the Western world is enriching itself on that. But the corruption inside Africa, and the mining, and often it's children who are down the mines, but they're protected by militia so that somebody might not steal the stuff that's being brought out. And I'm afraid all those militia rape the local women all the time, and children, and rape them all the time. So I've become involved in conflict, sexual crimes in conflict. And when the Russians invaded Ukraine, a task force was created of international lawyers, and I was asked to join it to look at sexual crimes, because there had been already rapes had taken place in the very early stages. And I went out, and I've had links with the Women's Commissioner, and we've been involved in some of that. And then Zelensky's office and his chef de cabinet and I now run this task force on the taking of the children. So, I mean, you won't believe this, but, many thousands of children have been absolutely transferred out of Ukraine into Russia, just put into buses, because there was such a large amount of institutionalized care in Ukraine. So it was very easy to do that with particularly institutions referred to as orphanages, but the children wouldn't necessarily be orphans. They would be kids whose mother has cancer, and the father's been recruited into the army, or children were in these institutions. There were disabled children. There were children who had alcoholic parents or drug addict parents. There were children who themselves were sort of boys getting into trouble. So these institutions, they basically didn't have, what we've recognized is much better for children, is to replicate the family and to have fostering and try and fund grandparents to be able to look after their children. There was none of that going on. and Ukraine was a pretty corrupt and difficult place and poor place. So, for a long time, and I think they hadn't reformed any of that. So it was very easy for the Russians to basically empty these institutions and take the kids, and finding them now is very problematic. But I mean, the real thing is that it's not that there's a shortage of law.
Yeah.
There's plenty of law, that these amount to war crimes, but we have to create mechanisms for this to not happen in further wars, but also to get them back. And I mean, one of the things I'm saying very strongly just now is with the Trump administration and Trump saying he's going to negotiate a deal. Well, good luck. But I mean, in a deal, I want to make sure that the return of those children has to be part of any deal. I'm sure he doesn't even know that children have been taken, but that has to. I mean, because and I'm sure it was one of the reasons for taking the children was to have a negotiating, device. It's, you give us the Donbass and we'll give you your children back.
Yeah, gosh. But I also want to focus on your work in Afghanistan, because that was remarkable. I mean, when the Taliban came in, but you sort of just swept down, it seems, and with the the pressure that was coming. Well,
that was an incredible business. You see, in the mid 2000s, there was the invasion of Afghanistan, and then that was before the Iraq War, and then the building over all those years of the attempts to create some sort of democratic nation. And doing those things is so much harder than anybody, than certainly the Bush administration realized. But good things did happen. And I was involved with the International Bar Association at the time. I was co-chairing the Institute of Human Rights. And one of the things that I was arguing for very strenuously was that women should be allowed to go into the law schools now that they were, opening things up, that women should be allowed into the law schools because there should be a cadre of women judges. Why women judges? Because, why especially, was because we knew that the women would not divulge things to a male judge. They wouldn't want to talk about the ways in which they were violated, the ways in which they were sexually exploited. They wouldn't want to talk about child marriage, and they wouldn't want to have that conversation. And so what we did was we insisted that they educated women in the law schools were opened, and that they should be able to become judges. And there were women judges, and I was sort of vaguely in touch with them, and I knew a number of them. And so when they were not included in the evacuations, when the 15th of August came, all the people who'd been helping the military and so on, and quite rightly too, that we had a duty to evacuate those people, but the women were not on the lists. And so then I started getting phone calls.
Absolutely.
And I have to tell you, I was on holiday when I got the first phone calls. And it was really horrifying because the women had, often imprisoned, they emptied the prisons. Once the Taliban got in, and at that period, you remember there were the 2 explosions, the women already were warned. 2 women had been assassinated earlier that year. 2 women on the Supreme Court. They were in a car on the way to the court, and a guy, an extremist, had shot them through the glass in the car and killed them both. And one of them was someone who was a really impressive woman, and there's a story in that too. But she, the women started contacting me, and so I started phoning up the Foreign Office and trying to get visas and stuff like that. Yeah. And the long and the short of it was they didn't get out, and they were hiding in their basements, and I was getting phone calls in the middle of the night from them, and then from others, because they would say, my sister's also a judge. And so we found out that Christians in America, very evangelical Christians, had a small community in Afghanistan. And somebody, one of my young women who works with me, had seen in the papers that they were evacuating the Christians. And so we contacted the organisation that was doing that was in the middle of somewhere in America, Wisconsin, or I can't know where it was. Anyway, Texas maybe. But anyway, they said, and I said, have you any room for my judges at the back of your plane? And they said no. I mean, I think they just didn't have room. And they said, but we can give you the details of the company that we're using, and you can charter the plane. It sounded great until they mentioned that it was £750,000 to charter this small kind of plane, $750,000. And so I thought $750,000, maybe we could do that. Who knows? Anyway, so they give me the thing. It was a Ukrainian, this was before it was in Ukraine. It was a charter company that took people on holidays to places on the Black Sea or something. And so we chartered this plane, and we thought we'd get these women into it. And it's a much longer story, but all I can tell you was it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, partly because I sort of said, yes, we'll book that plane for next week, and then I have to get money. I thought everybody would be pouring their hearts out to help. And I did raise a lot of money, and I tapped so many people. And I want you to know that there were people who were amazing. Yeah. I have to tell you, you have to be really bold when you're desperate. And so I phoned up a man that I know I'd met on a couple of occasions, who was an Australian billionaire who lives in London. And I phoned him up and I said, Michael, and you need to help me. And he said, he went, of course. And I said, these Afghan judges, and I tell the story, and I'm trying to get them out of there, and they're going to be killed. And I've been told I contacted some people I knew in the security services, and they said they are one of the categories most at risk because they've been sending folk to jail who are now out of jail. And so I said, Michael, I need money. He went, yeah, what do you want, Helena? 50,000? And I said, no, actually, I was going to ask you for $1 million. And I heard him at the end of the phone going, ah! I heard him. And then he said, I think you better come and see me. Anyway, so I went down to see him, steel myself. And anyway, the long and the short of it was, I eventually said to him, this is your Schindler's List moment. Mm. And so the long and the short of it was that he started off by saying that he would give me half of it, but he would keep the other half. But he would bankroll it because I had to sort of start paying money out and transferring stuff, and he ended up giving me the $1 million. Anyway, so that was rather wonderful, and I've promised that he's going to have a place in heaven. And
it's already booked.
So yeah, absolutely. So that was that. But that was the first plane, and then we got those women out, and at the last minute we were going to try and send them to Qatar, and then Qatar said that they couldn't. They were overflowing with refugees, and they couldn't take any more. And so then I found out that the president of Greece was a woman who'd been a judge. So we managed to contact her and persuaded her that we just had these 20, at that point it was 27 women. And would she be able to, and she spoke to the Prime Minister, and it looked like a rather small and gracious thing to be doing. And so they took them, but with the families it was 130 people, and their husbands and their children. And then once they got there, they then phoned all their sisters and said, phone this woman. She's the Queen, she's related to the Queen. They didn't realize, they thought that having this title meant that I had somehow a fast track to it. And so all I can tell you is that we then chartered another couple of planes for the month later, and we got a whole other set. It was 103 women, so it was 508 people altogether we got out. But it was terrible. The deal we had to do for the second lot of people was that we would pay for their accommodation. And I became the most terrible woman. I drove my husband mad. Because I'd get phone calls in the middle of the night. And the other thing was that I found out, somebody told me, it was actually David Miliband, who does a rescue thing in America, and I'd phoned him to see if he could help. And then he said, no, but Airbnb have said that they might provide accommodation for refugees. And so I say, fine. So I get my young women lawyers to find out how do you contact the chief boss of Airbnb. And they somehow find this person who's in California. And I immediately phoned them up. Except, of course, it was about 3 a.m. in California. So this person in a very grumpy voice answers. And the long and the short of it was that Airbnb paid for the hotels
Really?
for 2 or 3 weeks for the second contingent, because we were having to pay for them. And so Airbnb, I also went to J.K. Rowling, I have to tell you, helped me and gave me, a big switch of money. So, I mean, but it was hard work. And it took a year to resettle the women. Really? Because how many did Britain take? 5.
Really?
And their families, I mean, but I mean, it was 5. Ireland took 20. Australia took 15. I had great difficulty in Europe. Germany was very good, but I had great difficulty with, I mean, I couldn't get the places like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, because they've had a backlash against immigration. Really, I thought the world would open its arms to these wonderful women, and it wasn't true. And it was Canada that came good. Gosh. It was Canada that came good.
Well, listen, one final question, because then I do have to turn over to the audience. But you mentioned they assumed you had a fast track to the Queen, but you are very close to the Queen. Did you not have a role in the coronation?
I have to tell you that the Queen gave me some money, and that's not for publication. The Queen actually sent me a cheque out of her own bank account. I mean, we're not talking a vast sum of money, but she saw that I was, trying to crowdsource, and I was interviewed for in the Sunday Times, and she saw a piece, and she then contacted my office and said, I'd like to make a contribution to help. So, people really did, and people surprised me, and it was great.
Astonishing. Fantastic. Well, remarkable, and well done. Well done, you.
It was hellish.
It was
but they're all.
But I said before, you were an effective person.
But these women are remarkable, and I'm in touch with them in Canada and all that, and they keep in touch. And in fact, they've all been having babies, believe it or not, because they were young judges. They weren't, like all of us, 110. They're really young, and they started getting pregnant and having babies. And I spoke to this woman that I was liaising with, who was a refugee person in Athens, who was helping to make things happen. And I said to her, oh, God, they're all getting pregnant. Can't you have a word with them? Because it makes it difficult. I'm saying, can you find a space? I've got a woman and she's got 3 children. And then the next minute was, no, she's expecting another one. So I was sort of saying, can we not stop this happening? And then Nadina said to me, have you ever worked with refugees before? She said, there's nothing to do during the day. What else? And in fact, we've got babies in Canada called after my young women lawyers. So it's very sweet.
Brilliant. Okay, but listen, I'm going to turn over now to people in the audience, and we've got people online as well. So if you are online, then please do put your questions in the appropriate place that you've been asked to put your questions. But I'm going to take some questions from the room first. I'll take a couple of questions, yes. I'll start with the person in the yellow cardigan at the front here. Just wait for the microphone, because then the people online can hear us better. Thank you, and I'll take the
Thank you, Helena.
person in the
I don't know
blue
if you
at the
hear
end.
me. I'm not good with mics. But thank you. I've just enjoyed your talk so much. It's just been wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm so pleased that I got a ticket and I'm here. Brilliant.
Thank you for coming. That was great. That's lovely.
Fab.
Thanks.
Do you know, I was thinking, what would I really like to know about Helena Kennedy apart from this? And I thought, how do you relax? But I thought, she doesn't relax, so why ask the question? But there we go.
No, listen, I've got 3 grandchildren who are fabulous. They're 8 and 5 and 5. And we go to the park, and I push swings, and I do those things at the weekend. I do. And I love the theatre, and I go to the theatre. I listen to music. I do the things that you do, I suspect.
Glad to hear it. You deserve it. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Another question. Yes, please. Oh, we've got somebody coming from online. Thank you.
I have a couple questions from online, so I'll ask a few of them. Helena, you have seen the absolute worst of society. How have you stayed positive in your work? And have you ever considered going into a different area of practice? And then a second question from Mary. She's asked, who is your hero/role model?
Let's deal with the business. Listen, I mean, I'm not Pollyanna in that I'm not ridiculous about the world's going to be fine tomorrow. But I am an optimist. I do try to find the best, look for the best and look for silver linings and do all that sort of thing. So certainly I believe in, that you can make change, and I'm always sort of looking for ways in doing that. One of the things that when Julia and I were having a chat earlier on, I've realized about myself that I am very outcomes driven. I like to see a positive outcome, guilty, not guilty. I like results, and then you can move on. But I do like to feel that I've achieved something, and so that kind of keeps the bus on the tracks. You know what I mean? And so I'm reasonably optimistic usually. I'm pretty depressed at the moment about recent events, but.
I mean, just well.
Oh, the second thing. So there was the first one was about, and who's my. There are lots of people that I admire. I mean, I really do, and people that I love, and men as well as women. My career would not have happened if there hadn't been men who had really been important to me. There was a great American lawyer. When I was in my 20s, I went out to the United States and I spent time with a law firm, and the main lawyer there, I met him, and he came and saw me in court. And I was being, Tigger, I was cross-examining people. And he kind of, he and his wife used to come to London regularly. And so the long and the short of it was they became great friends. They were like a second set of parents. My dad died when I was in my 20s. And so I used to go, and I used to have holidays with them and so on. And he was a great civil liberties lawyer. He was a great constitutional lawyer. And I learned so much from him. And sometimes he would come to London, and I'd look around and he'd be sitting at the back of the court, and he'd say to me afterwards, "You got angry. You must never, ever show anger in court." He was a very good mentor to have. And he really did help me sort of expand my horizons. And make me ambitious for ways in which law could be effective in creating change, because he'd been able to create change through the use of law. So he was a very important person to me. But, I mean, there have been other people. I mean, I've worked very closely in recent times with a judge, with David Neuberger, who was the president of the Supreme Court, and he and I worked very closely on a number of things on media freedom issues, concerning trying to protect journalists internationally so that we do get truth, because of all the sort of lying and misinformation that's around. And and wonderful women. I mean, I love Brenda Hale. She's a great friend of mine, and I think that she's also doughty and strong. We disagree on different things, but we're pretty like-minded on most, and I love her. I learn from young people. I don't want it to be that it's always people that are older than you. Being with the young, I'm surrounded by a group of young lawyers. The majority of them are women going into human rights at the moment, but I do have young men as well. They are so stimulating to be with. And when you want to thrash around, a legal argument that you want to do, it's wonderful being with really wonderful, bright young people. And they're going to do the business. They're going to. Some of them might even be here. I hope that some lawyers are in the making. There's a hand at the back of the room.
Yeah. So I've got one at the front, and then we'll go to the back. Thanks.
If I may, Professor Dimitri, I'm the head of the law department at
Could you just wait for the
Sorry?
mic, because we've got people online and it's hard for them to hear without the mic. And then I do have somebody at the front that I want to take.
Thank you, and I apologize for that. As an academic, I kind of drew on the understanding that I would be heard to the front quite clearly.
Yeah, it's for the online.
Indeed, indeed. So I was just explaining, head of the Department of Law at Goldsmiths, and you've just expressed hope that young people, future lawyers, potentially future female lawyers would be here. I have the privilege of being here with 10 of our students, most of them female, most of them in law, others in politics and international relations. Your lecture tonight, your conversation will have provided fantastic inspiration, there's no doubt. But is there any concrete advice that you can also provide, offer at the time that...
Specifically for young women or for any young lawyer?
Younger women and future lawyers, people more generally, that have the ambition and the enthusiasm and the passion for social justice and human rights that you have?
Well, I really do think that you have to be you should be determined that this is what you want to do, and keep at and just keep persevering in whatever way. If you want to practice at the bar, or you want to be a solicitor doing this kind of thing, or if you want to go into international law, where, I mean, for example, my team of lawyers who work for me at the Institute of Human Rights, we do programmatic work. Often it's about, helping to train lawyers in other places to take up cases which they can take to international courts, because they're often not, the law that's taught in many countries doesn't train people up for that, and that you can actually improve the human rights in your own country by taking, issues to, for example, to the UN Commission on Human Rights, where there's a universal periodic review, where you can say, we're not doing well enough in Uzbekistan because people are still being arrested and beaten up in police stations, and we want that to stop. So there's ways in which you can practice as a lawyer that is in the international field, that is not about being in a courtroom necessarily, but it's actually working on projects, raising issues of human rights in communities and all sorts of things, working around many issues, around the whole business of immigration, which is seriously more and more a challenge everywhere. But one of the things I think for women is that we have to be prepared to sometimes, speak out. The other day, I have to tell you, it's a sign of my age, but I was speaking at something, and some man started shouting at me, you haven't mentioned whatever, as if in a course of an hour you're going to be able to cover the whole world. And so, but he started shouting, and it was very interesting. I said, why are you shouting? You don't have to shout at me. And I felt there was a sense in which he was irritated that this woman was basically doing this tour d'horizon, but had left out the one country that mattered to him. Do you know what I mean? And so we've got to believe in and have our own self-confidence. And it takes women a long time often to get to that. For example, women often wait to be asked to apply for things. And I now run around ensuring that people do apply for things, that people don't just wait until somebody says, have you thought of becoming a professor, or have you thought of applying to become a King's Counsel? Because I too was guilty of that. I thought somebody would magically come and say to me, this is your time, your moment has come, And when I did eventually become a Queen's Counsel, as it was, and I applied, people all said, we didn't understand why you didn't apply before. And I said, well, but nobody said to me that that was an okay thing to do. And it's that thing of, I particularly you've got to remember, I was being educated for the bar at a time when it was very, very much an upper class thing, and it was very male. And so there was a sense in which that was the kind of person who became a barrister. So it did take a while for me to get over the hump of thinking, they're going to find out that I'm not the right person made a mistake in passing me in all of these exams, that kind of thing. And women have it more than men, that sort of imposter syndrome thing. And fortunately, I was brought up in a household with a mother who said, never think that you're better than anybody else, but nobody's better than you. And that's the sort of thing, is that we have to say that to ourselves. Yeah, you know, never ever go around, you know, swaggering about, you know, how grand you are. But basically, do not take any nonsense from anybody who makes you try to feel inferior. And so I really want to encourage all my young law folk, you know, to believe in yourself. And if you want to do something, be determined. You won't get there easily. Don't go this, you know, women have always had to go, you know, not up the main staircase, but out the window and up the drain pipe. And so look for other ways in which you can get to interesting things and make a difference.
Fantastic advice. Thank you. At the front here.
Hi there. I'm afraid I might bring the tone down a little bit. How do you reflect on that? We've had a tradition, I think, of people using the law to try and achieve political gains from the left. You know, your activist lawyers. You know, for that term's been weaponized a little bit, but that kind of idea. And it feels like we're in a period of people from the right beginning or having quite a lot of success from shaping politics and society using the law, and that being a really strategic focus from the right. And we see it with Robert Jenrick and other conservatives talking about leaving the ECHR, and you know the influence of right-wing Christian groups on certain Tory MPs trying to achieve social legal ends there. How do you reflect on whether that is actually different from previous decades, and how well the system might hold up to those challenges?
Listen, law has often been repressive. I mean, throughout the whole of the history of you know, law in making, has often been to keep people down and to prevent protest and all of that kind of thing. So we mustn't imagine that law only ever is being used for good purposes. It certainly isn't. And I've spent my life most of the time, you know, doing lots of cases where you know, law was being used in punitive and horrible ways. So I'm all too aware of the failings of law. When it comes, there's been a backlash against the Human Rights Act. I mean, the European Convention on Human Rights was created, remember, by a conservative government. It was Winston Churchill's great dream. And it is important to remember that after the Second World War, there was a sort of whole new world order being created, which was, we can't let wars happen again, a war of this magnitude, a world war. We also have to punish the people for the terrible atrocities that took place in the Second World War and the Holocaust and all of that. And so war crimes were, you know, and the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials were part of that. But coming together, there was also a sense in which there was a reshaping of society, that working class people had fought in that war, had sacrificed so much, had lost so much, that there was a feeling that we have to make societies fairer and more just, and that people were entitled to have a roof over their heads and to be able to know that they could earn a decent wage so they could feed their children, and that their children should be able to have an education of any kind. So there were all those aspirations that came out of the war and the creation of the welfare state and so on. And I do think that we've forgotten some of the urgency around the creation of that, which was to create justice. And I think that, and that was the genesis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then the European Convention of Human Rights. And, you know, Winston Churchill was saying, in order to make sure that these things don't rise up again in Europe, let's have protections of rights and so forth. And we thought that we were already were pretty good on most of this, and so we wanted to make sure that other places did too. And so it was drafted by a Conservative Attorney General, David Maxwell Fyfe. And so I'm always reminding Conservatives that this was your product, and it's actually a very good product. But it took a long time for it to be embedded into law in the United Kingdom. And it was only after 97, I chaired a thing. The other thing that I chaired was Charter 88, which was set up in 1988, and it was to create constitutional change. That I got from my American lawyer mentor. And I wanted constitutional change, and I was involved with a lot of people who did too. And one of the things that we're seeing is a backlash against it. And it's particularly been caused, of course, by the refugee crisis on the southern border, on our southern border, you know, on the Channel. And, you know, it is a manufactured thing. Because, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights had nothing to do with the European Union, although they've conflated it and made it sound as if it was. But it's really about trying to protect rights. And, you know, most of us, if you ask people, they want their rights to be protected. But they, you know, to infect the debate with an idea that there's some people who are unworthy of rights is what's happening. Or to create a hierarchy of rights so that, you know, certain people can have rights, but people who arrive here who are fleeing persecution have to have a lesser set of rights. So, I mean, I'm my concern just now, and it's the thing that makes me alarmed about what's happening in the United States, but also what's happening across Europe, is that the pendulum is swinging to a sort of authoritarian nationalisms, and that retreat is meaning that that law is being disregarded. We signed up to lots of treaties, and our treaty obligations are not being respected. You know, whether it's the Refugee Convention, whether it's the European Convention on Human Rights, whether, you know, and it's been happening. This erosion has been happening as we've become more distant from the Second World War, and we've forgotten the way that it really felt so much closer. And now it seems remote. Why should we be having to take in people who are being persecuted in other parts of the world and so on? And those conventions came into being because it was felt in a much more raw way at that time. I mean, so I'm feeling worried that there's an unraveling of the rules-based order that was made. I am concerned about that. But I somehow believe that pendulum that is swinging over here to the right at the moment and towards a sort of far-right positions on nationalism, on, you know, putting a ring around our nations, about ways in which, you know, I mean, it's partly because of an here I'll say this, it's partly because of an economic model that I think was always going to be a folly, which is about low taxes. You know, it was the Reagan-Thatcher period of thinking of creating an economic model which gave primacy to the market. Now I like markets. I like flea markets, and I like antique markets and farmers markets. And, you know, markets work, but it became turbocharged, and in a way that I think has been highly destructive, has created a few billionaires, a bit like during industrialization. You know, where people owned whole railways and things, and you had to invent regulation in order to constrain monopolies. And we're now seeing other kinds of monopolies, tech monopolies. You know, Elon Musk being this mega rich person. There are trillionaires now, Bezos and people. How did that happen? And it's because the economic model has made it happen, because we've driven down welfare as basically being unravelled, and because there isn't enough money to pay for that, and they're saying it's every man and woman for themselves, rather than the collective wanting to make a good society where there is childcare even for the poor, where there is good education for everybody that isn't costing a bomb, and which those things. You know, should be part of what it means to live in a society in which we are doing it in each other's interests. Well, I think that's going out of the window, and it's been partly because an economic system was created and sold to the World Bank bought it, the IMF bought it, and so on, but we will have to. It will take a long time to cure it, I'm afraid, but it will happen.
Okay, so I've got time for 2 more questions. So, person there, and then this person over here. I'll just take two at a time, has been waiting a long time as well. First, yeah.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, if I may, about the question of women getting older and aging and what happens to their value in society. And I ask it in a context of...
I'm one of them.
well, at Goldsmiths University of London, a whole professoriate level of women was erased over summer, and a lot of other women academic staff. And I wondered at the way in which the value of women's accumulated knowledge, their expertise, is increasingly not being valued when we felt we had entered an age perhaps when it might have been possible as we age. I wondered what your reflection was on that.
Okay, just hold that thought, because I've got one final question over here from somebody who's been waiting very patiently.
Thank you so much. That's hugely inspirational and uplifting. I feel you have a real sense of love and empathy for people just through your natural value system in the work that you do, staying up at night, making phone calls, going out of your way beyond your profession, which is really lovely to hear. And do you see many others like yourself, or do you feel like you're uniquely blessed to have this? And did this come through your family values from your dear mom? And because I feel like you have something more beyond, like your trained profession, and which is rare to see. Like, I feel like you can sense the energy is very real, and you really care about people, and which is very rare. I mean, you have people in the legal space who do things because they have to do it or to look good, but yours seems to stem from within. So do you see much of that in the world around you, and there's a lot come down, transcended from your family? But it's beautiful, very inspirational, and God bless you. Thanks.
Thank you for
Thanks,
saying
Akura.
that. Thank you for saying that. Well, I'm going to come here first, and then I'll come back to that, so we finish on that. Listen, let's not forget that not too long ago, the women in the BBC, do you remember the woman who was the correspondent in China? And she finds out that, and she's an older woman, she's at the top of her tree, and she finds out that the guy who's doing the same job in Washington is earning sort of like twice as much money as her. Now, that business of valuing women is still a challenge, and we're still having to do that around equal pay, around all those sort of things. One of the areas where I think valuing of age is a problem for men in this society as well, except when they're highly professional. What happens, you look around, and it's very interesting that I see how men who've been former this and that end up becoming, particularly, for example, something like diplomats that worked in the Foreign Office, they end up on the boards of big companies and so on. Less of that is offered to women, apparently, and that's what the women in the Foreign Office tell me. It doesn't happen for women, and it's because, of course, there are still areas that are very much dominated. There's still male areas. In the law, we've had to work much harder to make sure that women could get into, big commercial law firms and so on. And it's now happening more and more. But at the senior partnership level, there's still a dearth of women making the mega bucks and so on. And so women, we follow that. It's not my area of law at all, but I certainly am aware of it. But women who are there is a thing about, I don't know whether it's about not valuing women's wisdom as they get older, but valuing male wisdom. I don't know whether that's true or not. One of the things that's rather remarkable about the House of Lords is that the women often are the people who say the most wise things. So we shouldn't, there are incredible women in there who've done public service all their lives, and they end up in the House of Lords. I think that there's a way in which those divisions travel with us up through our lives, and we haven't managed to sort of iron them out yet. But I'm confident that they will be ironed out. They will, and we're getting there. But I'm sorry to hear the story about the women professors at London University finding themselves being sort of packed up and sent on their way. But women in television, women in very visible slots and so on, they find that too, that there's no space for them. That's why I do radio now.
Okay, and on the final,
I want to, on your final thing, the wonderful thing is that in the field of law that I now operate in, I meet the most wonderful people. And they are like me. They do lift the phone and spend the time and go all the hours. And I have battles inside the International Bar Association over paying proper salaries to my young lawyers, because they say, well, they can't be too differentiated from the people who run conferences and the people who do this and that. And I say, yes, but my people don't stop working at 5 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock at night. They actually are still at it, writing papers, preparing submissions for things, being on the phone to the people who are weeping because their children have been taken from them or whatever, as in the situation in Ukraine. So no, I think that there are loads of people who still go into law with that good intent, but it's becoming more and more difficult because there's no legal aid and all of that. I can't imagine anything more dull when I see the lists of seminars on mergers and acquisitions and the law of the sea. So there are whole things that I think, oh my God, I would hate to be a commercial lawyer. You might earn a ton of money. Apparently, the young ones starting in those places earn, far more than I earn or have ever earned. But it's the satisfaction you get out of the work. Anyway, there we are.
fantastic. Listen, we are going to have to grow it to a close, but thank you so much.
Thank you.